In our lesson for January the 11th, we turn our attention to the book of Nehemiah. If you'll look at Nehemiah chapter 2, this is our text for this week's lesson. One of my favorite writers today is a man by the name of Leonard Sweet. He is a prolific author and a very intriguing way in which he writes. And one of the things I remember seeing the other day, he compared what he called a Hebrew proverb with what he calls a postmodern proverb. And the Hebrew proverb, he said, is where there is no vision, the people perish. And it's one that we've heard preachers and leaders have used that across the years. But he sets beside that what he calls the postmodern proverb, and the postmodern proverb says, where there is only vision, people have nervous breakdowns. And that's a great thought. It's one thing to have a vision and to say, this is what we're going to do. It's a totally different thing to be able to say, and here is how we're going to be able to do that. Unless you have a plan to go along with the vision, it often causes people to have nervous breakdowns. Nobody recognized that truth, I think, more than Nehemiah. I love Nehemiah. This is one of the great books of the Bible. Nehemiah recognized that you not only had to have a vision, but you also had to have a way that you were going to flesh out that vision. And the book of Nehemiah describes exactly how Nehemiah does that. So mark Nehemiah. We'll be in it a good bit of the rest of this quarter. We begin in chapter 2, verse 1 through 8 with what I call Nehemiah's burden. As the book opens, we see Nehemiah serving as the cupbearer, chapter 1, verse 11, to the king Artaxerxes, who is the ruler of Persia. Now, cupbearer, we think, yeah, it's not very important. Bearing his cup, how important could that be? But here is the person who was closest to the king, somebody who could determine what the king would drink, whether it was safe for him or not, and he had the ear of the king. So Nehemiah is in a very important position under King Artaxerxes in Persia. He is in Susa, which is the winter capital of the Persian Empire. And while he's there, he gets a message from a man by the name of Hanani, who reports to Nehemiah about conditions back home in Judah, in Jerusalem, and in the Hebrew promised land. And it's not a good report. He reports to Nehemiah that the people are flailing, that they are kind of struggling with their life. The walls of the city are completely demolished, and so the city is not being protected, and nobody is doing anything about it. Hanani brings to Nehemiah a very grim report of what's happening back home. Now, Nehemiah knows that he has to do something to alleviate the problem. But one of the things we see in Nehemiah is that he doesn't act without thinking through what he's going to do. He doesn't act until he determines a strategy to follow. And one of the hints of this is to see, look at Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 1. He receives the word about conditions back in Judah in the month of Kislev, which is December. And then look at chapter 2, verse 1. It says he brings this matter before the king in the month of Nisan, which is April. So he gets the message in December. He doesn't act until April. So he has December, January, February, March, all of this time in which Nehemiah is thinking through exactly how he needs to deal with this problem. The other thing we see about Nehemiah is that he doesn't act before taking the matter to the Lord. During these 4 months, he's not only thinking, but he's also fasting and praying about the situation back home. And so after 4 months of fasting and praying, he begins to lose weight. And his face begins to be a little, sinking down, and he loses weight. And the king looks at him one day and says, chapter 2, verse 2, "Why does your face look so sad when you are not ill?" And Nehemiah now is in a position to lay his plan before the king. The king says in verse 4, Nehemiah, what do you want? But notice that even here, he doesn't launch out on his plan until he first of all talks to the Lord. Verse 4 says, then I prayed to the God of heaven, and then I answered the king. So we see Nehemiah